Hey reader, welcome back to the channel. This is Centaur here, and this week we are talking all things Adepts. So if you like Protoss Adepts, this week is going to be great. If you don't, you should seriously take a look at them because there's a lot going on here. Obviously the full review will be coming out this Friday because it'll be part of our Friday content, but for today's video, we're going to be talking about the top 5 tactical cards for use by Adepts. Now, obviously, because of the fact that this is a ranged unit that does have a melee attack, technically speaking, all of them are useful. Right? The only question here is a matter of which ones. And I'll be honest, I'm not even entirely sold that my list is like for certain the top 5 because there are some things that I weighted a little bit in my final estimations for those final slots that I'm like, you know what, I feel like this might actually be a useful thing because of how adepts work. And if you don't necessarily agree on those, don't worry about it because we're going to talk about those on Friday. But just suffice it to say for now, as we're taking a look at these, adepts do have a lot to offer. They can do pretty reasonable damage, sometimes even really good damage. They're very fast. They are reasonably resilient for being a light unit, right? Because obviously we're not going to compare them to armored units, right? We're not comparing them to things with a 4 plus or a 3 plus armor save because it's not what they are. And per the way that the video game is, they never could be in this game. There's no way to make them that way, right? Because we are trying to bring the RTS game to the tabletop. And so, toward that end, just know that as we're looking at adepts, they actually have a lot going on, which means pretty much every card at some point is going to help. So if I do miss your card, please let me know down in the comments below. But just know that in advance, you know what? You're probably right, at least to some extent, that there is something there that we are not really assessing here. And so to start off with, they're known for mobility, right? I mean, this is actually what they're used for. They're used typically for early game scouting, as of the Legacy of the Void style era of Starcraft 2. They are a really great way in this game to be able to swiftly claim objectives or to threaten or redeploy. Okay, where you're sending out that shade token and you might end up sending them to a whole different spot instead of where they are right now, and you're not going to know until the end of the round whether or not that actually happens. So like there's some mind game shenanigans stuff that's going on. But mobility is a really big part of these, and anything we can do to make them more mobile does have benefits. Second, damage support. What do I mean by this? I mean that, first of all, they do reasonable damage on their own. Don't see these as your big time heavy hitters. Okay, especially against armored targets. More on that on Friday. But they are going to do some of that extra supporting damage. And the fact that they have anti-evade on their short range damage, alongside the ability to hand out precision 1 to any friendly unit on any of its attacks. Could be a ranged attack, could be a melee attack because it just says weapon on it. It means it has to be a weapon thing. So, overcharge nexus, for example, which just does hits to a target, wouldn't do anything. We'll see how kind of special attacks and special abilities factor in with that because, as far as I can tell from the wording of the Ionic transfer, it would still need to be a weapon in order for it to work. But suffice to say, it's giving precision 1 as long as the target is within 4 inches of the shade token, right? And so the result is that like you're both doing some damage to the enemy, but you're also kind of augmenting the damage of the whole rest of your army because as long as people are shooting at units or slicing at units with their side blades near the shade token, one thing that would have missed in all of their pools becomes a hit, which is really, really good, especially when you can run multiple adepts relatively easily and have multiples of them out there. So now you can have multiple shade tokens, right? Then you have the durability side of things. This is important. You do need to be able to survive long enough that your supply value of 1, which only lasts as long as you have more than 2 models still left in the unit. Okay, so you can only lose up to 7 wounds before you start dropping down to supply 0. That 8th wound is what's going to bring you down. Anything we can do to keep that number from showing up is good because adepts, one, that are at half strength or less, are not doing a lot of damage, period. There's not really a way for you to make them really good damage dealers. So that's already a problem. They don't really have a lot of support abilities beyond the Shade token, which is also potentially a problem. So, like, if they aren't doing a lot of damage for you, like, I mean, yes, they'll still technically be mobile if you're horrible everywhere on the battlefield, that's not really any better than being horrible in one part of the battlefield, right? So, like, toward that end, just know that anything we can do to keep them alive longer is advantageous, okay? It is going to help with making sure that the energy does its job. And the final thing that we really need to consider, even though it doesn't look like it on the card, anything we can do to mitigate the amount of psionic energy that we are using on adepts is going to help. Because while adepts are only going to use about 1 to 2 psionic energy per turn, the fact that they're so cheap and there's a reason for you to take multiples of them means that aggregate between all of them, they're going to eat a lot. And I mean a lot of psionic energy. And especially at lower levels, we'll talk about this more on Friday, that is actually a serious problem. Okay. And so anything we can do to reduce the amount of psionic energy that they are spending, either by not having to use an ability or by reducing the cost of those abilities down by one, all of those are going to be good. So when looking at our faction choices, I'm going to go with the Khalai on this one. One, because I take Daylon for most of them so far, and I feel like maybe sometimes people think like I don't actually recognize the value of Khalai, because I've definitely gotten that comment before. Just know I do like it. It is in fact good. It's just that sometimes the damage mitigation that can come from the Daylon is a little bit better, and sometimes the ability to quickly pull things into reserve is better. In today's case, I think Khalai has it handily. Okay, the first ability, Pylon Weapon, allows you to place a pylon down on the board, which is always nice. We love pylons. But the big thing too, and this is critical, is that it's going to help us with a lot of additional stuff. Really, almost everything that an adept wants to do, this is going to do better for us. Okay, and then with Bound by the Kala, relatively simple ability. After a unit activates, you then get to activate another unit that is eligible. So to activate, so they can't already be activated. This is not a way to double tap a unit, but it does mean that we can effectively activate two of our units at the same time that an opponent would only be able to activate one, right? So we're speeding up the amount of time that we can finish and close out the movement phase. Now, this is really important for adepts for 4 reasons. First of all, it means that we have a little greater freedom of deployment. We're not just limited into our standard entry edges. We don't have to spend Vespine gas in order to give ourselves additional deployment options. Instead, we use our completely free faction card every single turn as needed to deploy a pylon. And the pylon now becomes an entry edge around its base for our units. The biggest benefit for adepts here is that, yes, I could deploy an adept normally, move them, maybe even perform a place action with a warp prism, which is effectively spending 1 psionic energy because I have to tap a card, and then maybe also do, say, like a shade movement, and at the end of the round, place myself in another place. But that costed me another psionic energy, right? That is potentially very expensive, especially if I'm planning on using resonating glaze for damage output in the assault phase of the turn. Whereas if I already have a pylon down, I can't use it the same turn I call in the pylon. But on the turns where I have the pylon already starting there and down, I might be able to just get away with a move action and be where I need to be. And suddenly I've saved psionic energy on the shade token, which is really nice. But in addition to that, if when I end, I'm still relatively close to the pylon, the pylon's rules itself states that once per round, a unit that uses a psionic energy ability within range of it can reduce the cost of their psionic energy for that ability by 1, which means I can now deploy and slightly move an adept unit to where I want them to be, still keep them near the pylon, and use resonating glaives for free every single turn. That is phenomenal value because I took something that could easily be eating 2 psionic energy a turn and turned it into a unit that's going to be eating 0 psionic energy per turn. And that is phenomenally great. Furthermore, the ability to move 2 units in a single activation, especially when you're running adepts, is very useful because you can pass sooner. And one of the things that adepts really hate is when your opponent shoots first, knocks out a ton of the models in a unit, and suddenly it doesn't matter when that unit fires anymore because they aren't going to do anything. You want to be going first, and you want to be going with all of your models. And because of that, Khalai helps, right? To be clear, Dalam is good. Okay, the damage mitigation is really great. But as we will soon see later when we talk about one of the tactical cards, all you need to know is mitigating 1 to 2 damage off of a unit is not actually going to be dramatic when you lose wounds as quickly as adepts do. Okay. We talked about this a little bit with the zealots. The problem that adepts tend to have is that a lot of people tend to use them as skirmish units. We'll talk about this more on Friday, but just suffice it to say for now, a lot of them use them as skirmish units, which means unless you're willing to pay points, minerals for a sentry unit, keep them near the adepts, which is hard to do considering that adepts are fast and mobile and sentries are very much not. The result is getting an evade save on your adepts is extremely hard to do. So now we're only counting on a 5 plus armor, and there are no innate defensive abilities for an adept beyond having two shields and getting an armor save. That's literally all they have on their own. So, like, I think Dalem's fine. I think it's great. I don't think Mass Recall is nearly as good as Bound by the Khala, which is a every single turn ability that you can do. Um, I generally tend to think Khalai is going to be better for the adepts. Honorable mention before we get started, Twilight Council should be mentioned. Veil of Shadows gives you a heal 2 after a place effect, which you don't innately get with Adepts, but more on that. Actually, you do. And this is why it's worth talking about. Okay. But also Weapons of the Firstborn, you get long range 4 inches. Both of these are technically useful for Adepts. And the fact that the Shade action is a place 12 action is really nice because you can proc it. The problem, of course, is that that's end of round, which means you might have lost a lot of people so that now the heal 2 effect that you might be able to tap for Twilight Council isn't going to be nearly as useful. Compare this to using this on, for example, the Stalker, which we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks. And I mean, in my mind, it's night and day difference, right? One of them is very likely to be able to stack a large amount of wounds and then drop those off and then activate early and drop some more the next round. Um, this one, I mean, it is what it is. Okay. um, it is technically useful for adepts because it is a reaction in any phase. So you can use it with, I guess, end of round counts, question mark. I don't know that that's technically part of a phase. Um, but I think it technically does count. Like there is a utility there. Being able to improve your 8-inch range to a 12-inch range is not horrible. It means that now you're able to reach the same level as like Marines, base hydralisks, things like that. So like, it's not bad. I don't think it's nearly as good. And the fact that it's not helping you either run more adepts and the fact that it's quite a bit of SB gas per something that's kind of on the periphery means in general, I tend to take a Twilight Council, but I don't plan to use it on adepts. It's kind of the way I tend to treat it. So just things to think about. It's just like, it's fine. It's fine. I don't think that it's particularly great by comparison to some of the others. And so we look at number 5. We're going to start in a weird place, which is a gateway. And the gateway is going to seem kind of weird because you're like, Centaur, I thought adepts are skirmish units. They're ranged attackers. They are. They also can do close combat attacks. And there's a whole group of people who have been playing in the Polish tournaments that have so far happened, because there have been 2 of them so far, who have been using adepts as melee units. And they've actually been finding they like it an awful lot, interestingly enough. I think over time, maybe some of this goes down a bit as we start getting armored melee units more consistently. But just suffice it to say for now, giving yourself precision 2 when you're rolling 4 attacks, hitting on a 4 plus, which means you're going to hit with 2 and miss with 2, making those additional 2 misses hits, and then potentially turning those on surge into bypassing armor. And then from there, also being able to add in the fact that you can potentially have Pierce Light 2 on these guys means you can do dramatic amounts of damage in close combat with these, which is fantastic. And if you're intending to use these as kind of like a front line to screen off stalkers, sentries, down the line, immortals, any sort of unit that would prefer to be completely free to do ranged attacks without granting an evade save, all of this is advantageous. Right? We want to make adepts as good as we can in close combat because they're going to be the front line, the relatively thin line, keeping people away from our other supporting damage units. It's also just really cheap psionic energy, and this is, again, something that is not to be neglected. Because of how cheap adepts are, you can run a lot of them, but that means, depending on which upgrades you take, you're going to need a lot of psionic energy in order to actually get those adepts to work. And the result is just having a card that is only 25 SP in gas and thus is contributing 1 psionic energy for relatively cheap is a really nice thing to have. Furthermore, it does provide you with a core slot, which means you can field an adept unit with it, right? This is not cutting into or helping you purchase other units. It is actually actively helping you to buy adepts, which is not bad. And then finally, like, it's obviously not a desirable situation to be in with adepts, right? We don't really want to be involved in close combat for very long. If we do, we really want to strike first, especially just in case everything goes badly in close combat. But if you do happen to be in there, this is going to keep you alive longer and it's going to help you be better at your job without having to spend dramatically large amounts of Vespene gas for the exact same bonus because, of course, we have multiple kinds of gateways. At number four, we have the Forge. The Forge is the defensive building, right? It's the one that helps to improve your defense. And we don't currently have any of that with Adept. So I'm not going to lie, tough one is great, right? You'd have to use it before rolling for the armor roll. So you can't like look to see how well you did and then decide if you want to add tough one. But it does mean that you can knock one of those hits out, and that could be one or two damage, possibly more than that. Obviously, we don't currently have anything that gets like Pierce Light 3 at the present moment, or just as a base damage of 3. But I mean, as we look around at upcoming things like the Siege Tank, as we look at upcoming abilities that might just be special abilities that deal a straight amount of damage, in my opinion, anything that removes a hit is going to make the top five, right? Because down the line, that is going to save you quite a bit, especially when each of your models only has 3 wounds, right? The critical hit is fine. Probably the biggest benefit behind critical hit one is that in this game, you are not able to stack bonuses. And currently, we have Surge D3 plus 1, which is great. And if we add critical hit one, it's almost like we got another thing through Surge, except that it's safe from some of the things that can cancel out Surges, right? Like the dodge roll. And so it's just yet another way to take a bunch of our hits and turn them into actual damage. And make sure that armor saves aren't going to complicate that, right? Anything we can do to make our damage more steady is going to be advantageous. The biggest problem with this is twofold. First of all, the damage mitigation by comparison to how easy it is to do wounds in the first place is probably not going to matter that much. This is the unfortunate thing about Adepts. A 5+ save and not having a reliable way of getting a 5+ evade save is not reliable for saving your models, which means saving 1 wound, maybe 2 off of a given strike is not likely to make a dramatic difference on the battlefield. It is unfortunate, but that is just the place that we're in. The fact that we don't have healing on units is part of the problem for Protoss. It's part of what makes it fair because Protoss units are pretty tanky and they're pretty beefy, especially in comparison to their cost. But it does mean our defensive tactical card abilities are not nearly worth as much because when damage starts slipping through, there's not really much you can do to actively mitigate it. The other issue too is that critical one is fine on ranged attacks from an adept, but they're only doing damage 1. So if you have this in the same army as a stalker, which is doing damage 2 to everything, light and armored alike, there's not a lot of reason to use critical hit 1 on an adept when you can use it on a stalker. That's just my personal opinion. So I would lean personally towards saying, yeah, have a Forge by all means. I tend to run Forges also just because they give you an elite slot and I like stalkers. But let's be honest, it may not necessarily be the best card to kind of hold on the side and say I'm saving these for my adepts. Now, when we get into the top 3, all of these are cards that I will actively use with adepts pretty regularly, and I've been playing with adepts a lot recently. The first one is the Observer. This is probably gonna be the highest that one of the detector style cards is gonna get in one of these assessments. But I think this is actually a really, really good card for adepts. One, because surveillance means we place down a token within 6 inches, people are going to lose that hidden special rule. So there's less chances of people shenaniganing their ways out of your attacks. And if we're buying adepts and we're spending as much psionic energy as we are, gosh darn it, we want to get some damage out of this. Okay. And we need to, because if we don't hit first with adepts, we're going to take a beating to the face and we're not going to be very effective after that. Gravity boosters is also useful, kind of a weird way. This is typically kind of the throwaway ability on a bunch of these detector units, where it's like, okay, yeah, like they technically allow you to do something else. But here, and this is actually really, really important, okay? Uh, the Adept does not have the ability to roll 2d6 and take the higher dice when it comes to charging, which means you're stuck on move 5, which is admittedly not bad, plus whatever you roll in the d6 roll. But there's a lot of swing in that. And in my opinion, if you're planning on running Adepts as an aggressive charging element, more on that on Friday, having access to a when I need it on tap, I add one to make a charge work is really, really good. Like, really, really good. And so, in my opinion, just taking a quick look at the gravitic boosters here, I think that's actually an extremely useful ability, more likely than you'd think. I don't think it's like, top tier A plus. You should always be taking these if you're running Adepts. But I do think that both of these are very, very useful, and that's nice. The biggest issue that holds it back from being in the top two is the fact that it's very reactionary. It doesn't actually help the adept with what it does. It covers over potential things that might go wrong if you use your adept a certain way. And so it's useful, but I don't think it's necessarily the best. And when we get to the top two, I'll be honest, you could probably flip these two if you really wanted to. I I think I have them correct, okay, in terms of their use. And the first one, in second place slot, is the Warp Prism. Okay, now the Warp Prism has two abilities. The first is a place 3 effect. This is useful if you have the Twilight Council. It's also just useful for Adepts, right? And we'll talk about this down below. But then in addition to that, we also have Warp Conduit. And Warp Conduit is I get to deploy a unit at the end of the round anywhere on the battlefield, pretty much as long as it doesn't start too close to where your guys are when I place the token. Could be really close to people after you've finished doing all of your moving in the movement phase, right? Which is nice. Every army gets one of these, whether it's a drop ship or an overlord. The Warp Prism is the one for the Protoss. These are really great. First and foremost, the drop with Warp Conduit is a very fast, very safe deployment. Yes, it comes at the end of turn one or turn two, whenever it is that you choose to place this thing, right? Because potentially, depending on what you're playing on, especially if you're playing at skirmish, and maybe you lead off with like, you know, two stalkers and a zealot unit or something like that, just to get all of your supply, say you start with supply four, you get all those out, and then maybe you've got 3 adept units and you're just going to drop an adept unit every single turn after that, with your extra remaining 1 supply or something like that, maybe more depending on if you've started losing people. If you end up doing this, you could potentially do this every single turn just to drop people off at critical points where you need them. And the most important thing is their supply 1 is going to be preserved because they couldn't take any damage on their way to the objective. And this is important because if you do suffer damage on the path to an objective, you are, I'm sorry to say it, there's a very good chance you're going to get to the objective and not actually be that helpful, right? Because they only have to do, again, 8 wounds to you, which can be relatively easy to do, especially if they have multiple units shooting at you. You might find that you're not actually contributing anything. And currently, the Protoss do not have a tactical card like Supply Depot, for example, that allows you to just improve the supply value by 1 of a given unit, right? That's within blah, blah, blah range of something. Okay. The result is that, from my perspective, as I look at it, while yes, you're kind of missing out on an entire turn with the unit, it's also making sure that on the following turn, your entire unit gets to help you, which is not necessarily bad. In addition to that, the place 3 effect, of course, is I think the one that's more useful for adepts. First of all, because if you get a 5-inch move followed by a 3-inch coherency, so really kind of an 8-inch move, and then you get a place 3 effect, which is an extra 3 inches. Now we're up to 11 inches of movement, plus coherency, so another 3 inches, so 14 inches of movement, plus the shade. You are now looking at a 14-inch move during the turn, chance to shoot, and then at the end of the turn, another 12. That is a 26 inches before factoring in another potential coherency. You may not need to cohere even further away. In fact, because of the fact you only have an 8-inch range, you might actually want to cohere closer toward the enemy and maybe even further back to where you were. Like, there is a lot here, okay, in terms of movement. You can move really far with this on a given turn, and it's happening in the turn, which is great, okay? It's a relatively expensive Vespene gas card to get an extra 6 inches of move on an adept, but that extra 6 inches could be the difference between an adept unit contesting or not contesting an objective in a given round. Because remember, the phase action, we're going to talk about this on Friday, the psionic transfer action with the shade token happens at the end of the round, which means it happens after the scoring and cleanup phase. So you can't like shade toward an objective and then be able to cohere and get onto the objective before the scoring happens. It happens after the scoring happens. So you're already not going to be on the objective if you're not close enough when you start shading as it is. then you're just going to be scoring the next turn. In my opinion, the Warp Prism could be the difference between scoring on an objective or not, which is not bad, right? And on its own could win you the game. So, in my opinion, top two. But I think that there's an actual better card than the Warp Prism because it does the same amount of helping you get places while saving you potentially psionic energy, while also helping you in other aspects of the game. And that is the Warp Gate. Now, I am not generally as big a fan of the more expensive gateways than the less expensive gateways. However, Warp Gate has a benefit, assuming that you're not playing against somebody who's already moved out a card, who's playing Terran, they've already moved out a unit, they tap their orbital command and say, ha ha ha, you can't come in from something that isn't an entry edge. But presuming that they don't have that out, the warp gate is fantastic for two reasons. First of all, you get warp in, and warp in allows you to choose a non-entry edge, so it can't belong to your opponent, it can't belong to you. I think it's not a player's entry edge, so it can neither be yours nor theirs, and it allows you to then choose that edge, that table edge, anywhere along there as your deployment spot, and then you move on, right? And whether you're playing skirmish, whether you're playing standard, the most important thing you need to know about this is that if you have a 5-inch move followed by another 3-inch coherency, you can get in range of almost every single objective in the game as long as you can use a warp gate, which means we don't have to shade at all if we don't want to. We can shade if we want to have, for example, a precision one, right? Granted, for our ranged attacks, convert one hit into one miss into a hit. It's not horrible. Can help our other units as well. I think the big thing to consider is that you're spending a psionic energy in order to get that bonus for the shade. So is one energy worth converting one miss into a hit? I don't know. Two misses into hits, maybe. Three misses into hits, probably. But because it's kind of like the equivalent of a card giving you precision 3 at that point, just split up between different attacks, which might actually be better because you might be able to take advantage of surge more often. But the critical thing here is that this is actually meeting a lot of needs in a single action ability that you can do every single turn if you really want to, right? Anytime you're bringing in a new adept, you just bring them on. Now, it has to be the first unit you bring on every single turn because you cannot use it if you've already brought on another friendly ground unit, right? But you know what? There's a decent number of times, especially turn one, turn two, where the first thing you bring on just staking an objective. That's not a bad idea, right? That's really not a bad idea. In addition to that, and this is, I think, also pretty obvious because we already talked about this with the gateway at number 5. Precision 2 in close combat is really great. Right? I mean, it's going to help to keep you safe. It's going to help to protect and preserve other units that may be behind it. Turning them into good melee units is actually advantageous for your entire force. It's going to help your stalkers be more reliable. It's going to help your sentries be more reliable. Your sentries being more reliable is going to keep everybody alive because they're going to give evade saves. They're going to remove debuffs. All of this is advantageous for you. You want all of this when you're playing this game. And honestly, for how much it's offering you, it's really not that bad. And similar to the warp to the warp prism, the warp gate is giving you 2 core slots, which means you can run more adepts, right? Like there's no downsides to this card. Now, obviously, depending on your points level, it's a lot of S-beam gas. So it could be limiting other cards that you may want. So you may not choose to take this one. Again, there are reasons for taking everything. But in my opinion, when I'm sitting down and I'm thinking through Adepts, this is now, as of the last 3 weeks or so, one of the first cards I add to my stack is the Warp Gate. I've been playing a lot of skirmish recently because I'm getting ready for the Nova Open, which will be a skirmish level 1,000 point event in September. And so fitting 40 in there is actually quite difficult. But you'd be surprised how effective an army can be just by having a Warp Gate. If nothing else, it solves a lot of problems of potentially having to march over somewhere else and being able to keep these guys, the adepts, kind of in reserve to be able to do some extra work later on, has proven to be pretty effective. So in my mind, I think this is the way to go. Okay, I think personally that the Warp Gate is fantastic and it's something you should definitely be looking at. But honestly, all of the cards again can be advantageous. But what do you think? Did I leave off your favorite card? Were you thinking I was gonna go Chrono Boosted Gate because a 5-inch move turned into a 7-inch move plus a 3-inch regroup plus potentially play shenanigans and stuff like that is obviously the best play. I'm actually not a big fan of chrono boosted gateways. More on that in a future video, but maybe you think it is. Or maybe in your mind, like, maybe the warp prism is actually the best option for these guys. Maybe I nailed it on the head with warp gate and you've never even thought of that before. Whatever your thoughts may be, let us know down in the comments below, and I will see you next time.